The Prehistory of Taldor. We start our history of the land currently called Taldor over 12,000 years ago, at the dawn of the Age of Legend, when half a world away, on an island continent in the Arcadian Ocean called Asland, the first and greatest human civilization was founded. Some scholars believe that the Aslanti arose from the slave pits of the Aboleths, possibly indicating that their masters had engineered the Aslanti from primitive human stock and gifted them with intelligence and power. Others claim that the Aboleths simply set the early nomadic and cave-dwelling humans on the path to a more advanced culture. Whatever the case may be, the Aslanti humans were a breed apart from their relatives on the continents of Avestan, Garand, Casmarin, and even distant Tianxia, and whatever had been changed in them made them superior physically, intellectually, and in terms of their capacity to master sorcery, wizardry, and all kinds of magecraft. The Aslanti were a proud race, with tanned skin and dark hair. They were also noted for their high brows, and for their most unusual trait, the deep purple color of their eyes. Their culture flourished for thousands of years upon the island continent of Aslant, reaching heights of art, philosophy, and science previously undreamt of by humans. During the time of the Aslanti Empire, not all Aslanti were content to remain on their island nation, and many established settlements in Avestan, Garand, and likely other places even further afield as well. I've already discussed in my video about Varissia how the exiled wizard Zin established the nation of Thassalon in northwestern Avestan. That was not the only remote settlement of Aslanti people before the Earthfall cataclysm. The wide basin on the eastern side of the World's Edge Mountains, known as the Valley of the Aslanti, is concealed by the rocky terrain of the World's Edge Mountains and the Whistling Plains, and those searching for it must traverse sheer cliffs, wide canyons, and raging rivers. It was settled by an enclave of humble Aslanti pacifists who named this valley Nel Shavotha, and they lived peacefully there for nearly 2 centuries. In its prime, the colony in this valley held a half-dozen small Aslanti villages, inhabited by settlers escaping the wars of their homeland. Even here, however, Earthfall brought the sky down upon them. Unlike the Aslanti cities of Old Aslant, this valley didn't get directly struck by meteorites, though the choking ash and darkness snuffed out most of their people. Yet it was remarkably well preserved despite the cataclysm, and it holds some of the most intact ruins from before Earthfall in the Inner Sea region, maybe in the world. Despite the valley's proximity to the heart of Taldor, explorers have ventured only into a handful of these ruins. Not only is the path to the valley naturally treacherous, but today the valley is watched over by a skeletal dragon. Originally a powerful and wise dragon who tutored the people of Nel Shavotha in the ways of philosophy, in hopes that their example would bring enlightenment and peace to all of Aslant, after the cataclysm, Torios the dragon arose as an avatar of destruction, for reasons that are unknown to modern scholars. Still longing for followers to whom she could teach her new enlightenment of oblivion, Torios has raised hundreds of fallen Aslanti as vampires, vampire spawn, and wights, and the ruined valley has become a twisted reflection of its living self, now blackened, broken, and rife with the shambling dead. In the 10,000 years since, the dead of Nel Shavotha have kept their focus on maintaining the valley's isolation, but this endeavor is not without its challenges. The temptation of so many Aslanti ruins has inspired countless questing knights, knowledge seekers, and pathfinders to risk life and limb to find this hidden wonder, though few survive to tell of it. After the Earthfall cataclysm of -5293, the surviving Aslanti who lived on the Avestinian mainland found the land had become inhospitable and dangerous, and banded together to build a refuge. These survivors constructed the refuge of Pegador, a safe haven built by Aslanti refugees who had survived the Earthfall. Unlike their kin who delved deep enough to reach the Darklands, the people of Pegador instead built a sprawling settlement that extended only a few hundred feet below the surface, avoiding the isolation and in some cases corruption that turned so many of their fellow refugees into Caligni, mongrel folk, Morlocks, and so on. The ruins of Pegador were only discovered half a millennium ago by modern Taldans. Yet despite all that time spent in exploration of the ruins, the scholars studying Pegador continue to uncover new tunnels, leading to large chambers and subsettlements, and the true scope of the underground city remains unknown. But it must once have numbered in the tens of thousands, given the enormity of the site. Today, several dozen researchers and their retinues plumb the city's mysteries, collaborating and sharing information as often as they jealously guard it from one another. Over the next 4,000 years, the Aslanti diaspora, who were too few in number, interbred with local indigenous peoples of Taldor, to such an extent that eventually most of their noticeable hereditary markers, including the high brows and the purple eyes, disappeared. Yet, despite this, the Taldan ethnicity of today, wherever they can be found in the Inner Sea, make a big deal of their ancient link to these long-dead but powerful people. The Taldan belief that they all descend from a special stock of superior humans has conferred upon them a reputation for arrogance and elitism. There was one pure-blood Aslanti, however, who survived all those long millennia, and didn't die off with the rest of his kin. An immortal hero who performed many legendary deeds, and who spent much of his life in those lands that would become modern Taldor. The last Aslanti was named Aradin, and the modern history of Taldor would begin when Aradin, taking the guise of a kindly old wizard, began to mentor a young man from the Tandak plains for whom the empire would later be named. This was, of course, the legendary unifier of Taldor, the first emperor Taldaris. The history of the Taldan Empire. From -1293 to -1281, General Taldaris conquered the scattered city-states along the Inner Sea, uniting them to form Taldor and become its first emperor. Over the course of their emperor's unnaturally long rule, finally ending with his death in -1144, citizens of the principalities of Taldaris came to see themselves as a single civilized nation, named Taldor, united against the barbarity of an untamed and unexplored world. Taldor spent centuries taming the wild lands within its nascent borders, battling gnolls, kobolds, and orcs that preyed upon its people and plundered its growing wealth. The first great threat to the nation came in -632, when the giant monster called the Tarask laid waste to the empire of Ninshabur to the east and eventually tore a hole through the World's Edge Mountains, forming the Porthmos Gap. The beast left a trail of death and destruction in its wake, leveling Oppara and many other Taldan cities before continuing across the Inner Sea into Garand. Taldor nearly ended in the wake of this destruction. For 2 centuries, rulers sought to rebuild, demanding back-breaking labor from common folk beset by widespread famine, fueling near-constant rebellions. Taldor finally began a campaign of civic improvements, such as aqueducts, canals, and roads, to appease its populace, and allowed its military to move more freely to quell the frequent uprisings. All of Taldor's achievements were truly put to the test, when the westward expansion of the Padishah Empire of Kalesh brought Keleshite armies to Taldor's southern territory, conquering its loosely controlled southern territories to create the satrapy of Qadira in -43. Accurately anticipating a long conflict, both nations began fortifying their border along the Jalrune River, although that border has moved both south and north of this point at various points in their millennia of conflict. A short while later, the region was forever changed when Aradin performed a miracle, raising the Starstone and the entire Isle of Kortos from the depths of the Inner Sea and becoming a god in the process. Aslanti culture and heritage surged in popularity, and Aradin's faith sprang up almost overnight. Seeing the works of this ascended Aslanti as proof of its superiority, Taldor established the center of the Aradinite faith in Oppara. Within a generation of this cultural revival, Taldor began its first major period of expansion, with the formation of the Great Army of Exploration. Commanded by the ambitious and ostentatious General Porthmos, for whom the famous gap was named, the army set out up the Selin River in the year 37. Porthmos and his army charted the Selin River as far north as modern-day Seven Arches in the southern river kingdoms, conquering the land as they went. Taldor officially annexed the land between the Forest and Seven Arches as the province of Galt in 115. Over the next 4 centuries, successive expeditions charted much of what is now Galt, Kionin, Rismirin, and the southern river kingdoms, establishing military and trading outposts as strategic locations up to the shores of Lake Carthan. In 499, Taldor once again set forth in a second army of exploration. This one headed north from Lake Carthan. By this time, the empire had built a strong economy based around the lake and aimed to secure those investments by exploring and studying the peoples with whom they traded, primarily Kelids and Varisians, who had lived there since the Age of Darkness. The army explored the region now known as Lastwall and Ustalav, but it was ultimately halted in its westward march by the orcs of the Hold of Belkzen. The trouble in this region didn't stop there. From 861 to 896, the Taldan Empire had its first encounter with the dark wizard Tar-Baphon in the region now known as Ustalav. For more details around this first war with the tyrant, please see my region deep dive on Ustalav, where this conflict took place. At the end of this period, Taldor recognized the kingdom of Ustalav as an independent nation. In 1520, Taldor turned its attention to expansion yet again, as General Corin led the Third Army of Exploration westward, along the northern coast of the Inner Sea, expanding Taldor's reach to the Arcadian Ocean. The port city of Corentin, in the shadow of the Arch of Aradin, was established as a western stronghold, and named in the general's honor. In 1553, Emperor Urios III and satrap Zerbistes I signed a formal peace agreement between their nations. A period of non-aggression known as the Urian Peace between Taldor and Qadira began and would last for almost 1500 years. The Fourth Army of Exploration, led by General Castellus, mapped and claimed the regions of Andoran. Lush and fertile, Andoran became an official province in 1707. In the lands of modern-day Isgur, however, tensions with the local Khelids in the region exploded in the wake of this conquest, making the Asphodel Mountains and surrounding lands among the most troubled regions within Taldor's borders. The so-called Asphodel campaign against the Khelid nations of central Avestan would last for over 400 years, the culmination of which we'll get to later. Two additional armies of exploration further expanded Taldor's borders in the 21st century. The fifth, from 2009 to 2014, extended the empire north through Rossland and Issia to the shores of the Lakes of Mists and Vales, and the sixth, from 2080 to 2089, ranged through northern Garand. The Sixth Army of Exploration never established a Taldan province in Garand, in part because the army met the forces of the Guerrilla King at the Battle of Nagisa in 2089. The Guerrilla King and his Charaka stole General Aristos Marbrand's great weapon, the World Breaker, and the general and his few remaining forces had to retreat back to Taldor in shame. Historians largely agree that this embarrassing loss, the consequence of the Empire's overambitious reach and inability to manage its farthest-flung resources, marked the beginning of Taldor's decline. In 2133, as briefly touched on earlier, the Asphodel campaign finally ended when the Seventh Army of Exploration slaughtered the Khelids who had been resisting them and established the Protectorate of Isgur and pushed even further north, occupying the nation of Druma. In 2331, Taldan occupation of Druma would end, when the Taldans, the dwarves of the Five Kings Mountains, and the Drumish people would come together to sign the Curse Accord, recognizing Drumish independence. The next few centuries would hold a number of setbacks in store for the great empire. In 2632, the first elves returned through the Severian Stone and reclaimed Kionin, pushing all Taldans in the region back across the Selen River. In 2742, a plague known as the Choking Death spread from Ayabaria down the busy trade routes, devastating Taldor's population, especially in the heart of the empire. In 2920, a massive earthquake devastated both Taldor and Qadira, killing tens of thousands and flattening many cities. Some Taldan nobles took this as proof of Qadiran worship of Rovagug. Several of these nobles formed a secret society called the White Wardens, and attempted a coup which was foiled in 2921 by Emperor Ramoke V. The emperor stripped members of the White Wardens of titles before exiling them, narrowly averting another outright war with Qadira. Despite these various calamities, Taldan power and influence continued to grow. By 3007, Cheliax was incorporated as a province of Taldor. This period represented the greatest extent to which the old Taldan Empire would expand to. Meanwhile, throughout these centuries of Taldan expansion to the north and west, the empire's long-standing rival to the south and east, Qadira, and the greater empire of Kalesh, built up its own fortifications. To those Taldans living south of Oppara and the river Porthmos, the Kaleshite threat was always at the front of their minds, and served as a motivating factor in the empire's growth and amassing of resources from across Avestan. After all, Qadira was but the westernmost satrapy of the continent-spanning Padishah Empire of Kalesh. For Taldor to stand a chance economically or militarily against it, it would need to span a continent of its own. The tenuous Urian peace had continued to hold even as both empires continued to grow in power and influence, but by the early 4th millennium it was starting to crack. The actions of the White Wardens of Taldor had frayed the already tense relations between the two empires, and despite Emperor Ramoke's condemnation of their propaganda, Qadirans began to take bolder action against their northern neighbor. In 3129, Emperor Jalrun was assassinated by Qadiran assassins. His successor, Emperor Hirot I, formed the Ulfan Guard to protect himself and all future emperors, an institution that remains in place even to this day. According to this storied and historic relationship, the greatest warriors from among the Ulfan people of the Linorm lands serve as honor guard to the bearer of the Primogen crown. The Ulfan Guard care only for their oath and duty to the crown, without personal or political ties to the rest of Taldor. They swear fealty to the imperial position, not the individual, and their sense of honor and loyalty is unwavering. Ulfan Guard members serve for at least a year, although it is common for members to serve for much longer. Once their service is up, they are given the title of Huskarl when they return to their home and are permitted to take as much loot from the royal treasury as they can physically carry. The growing tension with their southern rival would have to wait, however, as the machinations of the exiled White Wardens, and later a second conflict with Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant from the north, would occupy Taldor's attention in the 4th millennium. From 3660 to 3672, after White Warden conspiracists acquired a fabled orb of dragonkind, the Dragon Plague plunged northern Taldor into a campaign of terror and violence, brought about when dozens of metallic dragons were coaxed out of the World's Edge Mountains. The dragon plague left many cities destroyed, and thousands dead before Taldan heroes finally slew the last of the rampaging beasts. That decade of violence and dragon slaying still colors Taldor's culture. Noble families of any standing still boast of ancestors who hunted dragons in this era, or bid for artifacts of the age, or even continue to organize dragon hunts of younger chromatics still living in the northern wilds to this day, sometimes with disastrous results. From 3754 to 3827, Taldor engaged in its second war with a whispering tyrant, who was resurrected as a lich and regained much of his old empire, conquering his ancestral home of Ustalav. For more details on this conflict, please refer to my Ustalav video. By the end of the 4th millennium, the great empire of Taldor appeared to its ancient enemy in the south to have been greatly weakened by both the terrible dragon plague and the war with Tar-Baphon. In 4079, Qadira made its move, invading Taldor and capturing the city of Zimar, along with a good chunk of southern Taldan land. In the following year, Qadiran invaders burned most of the settlements surrounding Zimar in the Ember Night, a touchstone many modern Taldans still call back to as justification for their hatred of Qadira. The war with Qadira, deemed the Grand Campaign by Taldor's emperor, began in earnest, well and truly ending the period known as the Urian Peace. In order to fund the war effort, the Taldan Emperor's taxation of its remote reaches became harsher, and all the while, the rest of the empire wondered why they continued to fund the Heartland's endless war with its southern neighbor. Taking advantage of the chaos of the Qadiran invasion, Governor Aspects the Even-Tongued broke Cheliax away from Taldor, and declared himself king, claiming all lands west of the Selen River as territory of the sovereign nation of Cheliax. By 4091, he had also seized the province of Galt by threat of force. The river kingdoms became the independent fractious city-states that they are today. The history of the modern kingdom of Taldor. With the fall of the Taldan Empire, things were not looking good for the new kingdom of Taldor. Before the war was over, Qadira's armies had reached the river Porthmos, after a series of Taldan military losses the Taldans called the Gevran Massacres. In the wake of these various disasters, Emperor Sidonius III, who admired his nation in debt, was poisoned by angry nobles. He was succeeded by the first monarch of the new kingdom of Taldor, Grand Prince Beldam I, and Beldam did an excellent job of bringing a much-needed sense of resolve and conviction to the collapsing nation. Despite being weakened by both the civil split with Cheliax and its many losses to Qadira, Beldam began to lead a very successful military campaign against the southern aggressors. He launched the Heaven Steppe Offensive, which not only pushed the border back to its original position along the Jalrun River, but even pushed further to invade Qadira itself. This offensive was stopped short in 4328 when the greater Padishah Empire of Kalesh joined the war and reinforced the flagging Qadiran forces. The war continued along the borders, but with Padishah support in Qadira, the border saw little movement for the next few hundred years, despite a continued coordinated Taldan offensive at various points along the river. In 4528, Grand Prince Stavian I used the war with Qadira as grounds to initiate what he called the Great Purge. He criminalized the worship of Sarenrae and ordered all her temples closed. Worship of the Dawnflower is consequently still very rare in Taldor today. In 4603, Taldor and Qadira finally declared peace after 5 centuries of war. Trade between Avestan and Kalesh reopened, and worship of Sarenrae was declared legal again in Taldor. 3 years later, the Age of Enthronement came to a shocking end when Aradin, Taldor's patron deity, who had shepherded the early years of Taldor's great empire, died. The Age of Lost Omens began. In Cheliax, the death of Aradin led to a great civil war, the winner of which, to the ruin of all, was the House of Thrun, who were servants of Asmodeus, the Prince of Darkness. Nothing so dramatic happened in Taldor, however. The long years of struggle against Qadira and the experience of having lost their empire long before the death of their patron deity had turned the Taldans into a pragmatic lot. Taldans remained devout, but found other more benevolent deities to adopt as their primary pantheon. Most homes converted their shrines from Aradin to a small shrine to one or more gods who played an important role in family life. Erastil for farmers, Shaelin for artists and performers, and Abadar for nobles and merchants. The god Caidan Caelian also grew in importance in this time, with Taldans quick to point out that Caidan himself was Taldan before taking the test of the Starstone and ascending to godhood. Also in 4606, just months prior to Aradin's death in fact, Taldor made one final strange attempt to recapture its former glory. The naval admiral Orpheria Amandar set sail with a small Taldan fleet to discover new lands to conquer overseas, dubbing itself the 8th and final army of exploration. In 4608, the 8th Army of Exploration landed in Shenmen in Tianxia. Pushing inland, it conquered the city of Kamekobu and established the isolated Taldan colony of Amanandar. In 4667, the Red Revolution began in Galt. Many nobles fled into Taldor with little but their titles, creating an underclass of penniless nobles in the north. By 4689, relations with Qadira turned hot again, this time in the form of a new naval campaign, in which Taldan and Qadiran vessels began a period of intensified harassment and privateering against one another. Finally, in 4717, about 6 years ago now, the adventures of the War for the Crown adventure path take place in Taldor. In this adventure, the Grand Prince of Taldor, Stavian III, dies under unusual circumstances. Taldor's chief general, High Strategos Maxillar Pytherius, puts forth the claim that on his deathbed he named Maxillar as his heir, over his own daughter and only surviving heir, Princess Eutropia Stavian. The country falls into civil war, with various nobles and polities having already begun arguing that their chosen scion was the true inheritor of the Primogen crown. The heroes in this adventure path support the claim of Princess Eutropia, and they soon learn that powerful factions are poised against her. Despite this opposition, Eutropia's campaign prevails, and she becomes the new Grand Princess of Taldor by the end of that year. She is determined to shift Taldor from a crumbling, decaying nation hung up on its own former grandeur to a modern nation that is growing and changing with the rest of the world. Her agents were even present 2 years later, helping evacuate the survivors of Lastwall when the Whispering Tyrant made his terrible return in 4719. This brings us to today. Heritage and history continue to be the cornerstone of Taldan identity. Families of all social standing can trace their lineage back dozens of generations, and heirlooms hold enormous sentimental and monetary value. Swords from the Shining Crusade, elegant if mismatched tea sets dating back thousands of years, Aslanti amulets, to the point that Taldan markets boom with counterfeit antiques. Historical subjects feature prominently in the artwork, operas, and plays that Taldans adore, and even the smallest villages maintain at least a few statues of major historical figures or events. These reminders of the nation's glory fill every day of Taldan life. Yet, with Grand Princess Eutropia in charge, for the first time in hundreds of years, Taldor is finally starting to look forward, and not just backwards. There is an air of hope in the nation that has not been felt in generations, but who knows what the future may hold. Taldor Today. The modern borders of Taldor represent but a fraction of what the Empire once claimed. What remains, after centuries of upheaval and revolt, are those lands that have never known any rule but Taldor's for over 6,000 years. Thus, the Taldor of today is the heart of the Empire's history, the steady, stable trunk from which the mighty Empire's branches stretched, and on whose deep roots the modern nation stands. Few nations in the Inner Sea region boast as long and rich a history as Taldor, and few conceal as many secrets amid the seemingly tamed woodlands, cultivated fields, and polished cobblestones. The traditional colors of Taldor are blue and green, and their flag and imperial crest features a stylized version of the Primogen crown and a white lion. Lions are an important symbol in Taldor. The country's legendary founder, Taldaris, was said to have been raised by lions, and the seat of the hereditary ruler of Taldor, the Grand Prince or Grand Princess, is called the Lion Throne. Taldor even has a secret service agency, comprised of an elite unit of special operatives who serve and advance the interests of the crown, called the Lion Blades. Though the power of Taldor has waned much since the years of its heyday, the Taldor's blue and green heraldry is still immediately recognizable by anyone not living under a rock across the Inner Sea and beyond. The individual parcels of Taldor itself have traded hands countless times in the millennia of its existence, leading to an incredibly confusing jumble of claims of ownership. To standardize this chaos, the Lands Partition Decree of 3247 broke the empire into 62 prefectures and formalized the rules for changing the divisions within. Today, only 2 prefectures and 2 major provinces are widely recognized. The prefectures include Avin, Kazuhn, Krearis, Ligos, Lingian, Moda, Northern Tandak, Opparos, Porthmos, Sophra, Tandak, and Whitemarch, along with the Verduran and World's Edge provinces. Below the level of prefectures are the duchies. In their turn, duchies comprise numerous counties, and counties are then further divided into baronies. Not surprisingly, for a country with as ancient a legacy as Taldor has, being likely the oldest civilization of which some vestige is still standing in the world, the culture of the nation is deeply rooted in the relationship between land-owning nobility and its massive underclass of peasants. Taldor's noble class is comprised of dynasty-inheriting houses, most of which trace their lineages back to one emperor or another. Its members hold Byzantine titles such as patrician, magister, proconsul, mandator, exarch, viceroy, duke, and many others. A large number of scholars in the Primogen Library keep and update the genealogical records, as each title has a subtle place in the hierarchy of the empire. In the history of Taldor, the nobility have contributed to the greatness of its emperors, but also, on occasion, to their various downfalls. The Grand Prince can also raise any low-born citizen of the empire up to royalty by bestowing a title and wealth. But, tradition dictates, he does so only once a year, in a huge celebration held at the imperial palace. Among the numerous noble titles conferred upon Taldan citizens, there remain several ranks which retain a specific function within the governance of the state. While the meanings and grandeur of these titles may change over generations, the current government recognizes the following noble titles in hierarchy, from greatest to least. Grand Duke, a ruler of a prefecture. Only 12 High Grand Dukes rule the formally recognized prefectures, but 50 Lesser Grand Dukes exist also, whose lands have been lost or subsumed by other prefectures over time. A Duke. Landed dukes administer a duchy within a prefecture, and report to a Grand Duke thereof. Dukes who have not been conferred land but serve the Grand Duke are referred to as attending dukes. Senator. Senators are individuals who may cast a vote in the Senate. All senators must bear another noble title in order to be installed in the Senate. Count, or Earl. Both counts and earls administer a county within a duchy. These titles are generally equivalent in rank. Marquess or Landgrave. A marquess serves as the guard of a wilderness or border region, and typically has a standing army to defend the region. Similar in function to the role of marquess, the Landgrave administers an unsettled but important tract of land. Landgraves do not typically command an army to defend their region, and thus are seen as lesser than a marquess. Baron. Landed barons rule large territories known as a barony. A barony may contain a significant portion of land with numerous villages or a large city. Barons who do not administer a barony often serve as advisors to the crown. Viscount. Overseeing a portion of a county, typically a couple of small villages and their connecting roads. Tribune. Typically serving as a mayor and justice for a community, such as a village or neighborhood within a larger city. This is often an elected position, though it may be conferred upon an individual for political reasons. Tribunes usually report to barons. Lord. A ruler of a specific land rather than a community or village. Often this is agrarian land, with peasant farms, fisheries, or vineyards that owe a large tithe of their annual yield up to this hereditary lord. Lords often report to barons, though occasionally they report to a viscount instead. Knight, the lowest rank among Taldan nobles. Typically children of nobles are conferred this title first, especially those with military service. Only those of noble title may own land, though common people are allowed to move freely from one place to another, granting at least a modicum of encouragement for nobles to grant their subjects some freedom and control of the land they work. Low-born citizens pay a nominal tax to their local noble for use of their land, and the nobles in turn each pay a portion of their land's revenues to their immediate superiors, with the funds ending in the Grand Prince's treasury. Let's take a quick deeper dive into the prefectures and provinces, moving from top to bottom. The Verduran Province. One of the two provinces, the Verduran Province remains fiercely independent from the rest of Taldor, a part of the nation by agreement only, rather than direct governance. Taldor has always clashed with the Kelid Druids who compose the Wildwood Lodge, and claim all the Verduran forest as their own. As the Empire pushed back the edges of the forest, the Druids, along with the Fae and Treants of the woods, grew increasingly violent. In the midst of Taldor's war with the pirate queens of Zevedi, the demand for vessels to replace those the aquatic marauders sank became so desperate that Grand Prince Adavarian II signed the Treaty of the Wildwood in 3841, which ceded control of the forest to the Wildwood Lodge Druids and agreed to curb Taldor's logging operations in exchange for the Lodge's loyalty and pacification of the wood's most violent and unusual inhabitants. Taldor holds little authority within the forest, beyond a narrow band outlined in the treaty within 10 miles of the Selin River and the Verduran Fork. Small communities exist within the Verduran, often living off the land and venerating the green faith to maintain good relations with their druid landlords. The Wildwood Druids make every effort to uphold their end of the treaty, policing vengeful fae and pacifying or culling dangerous beasts that wander too near the borders. The Druids have no resource or interest in taming the monsters in the forest's heart, though, and drakes, ettercaps, monstrous vermin, tatzelworms, treants, and other large predators call the forest home. In addition to the Kelid Druids, the Verduran Forest is also home to the largest community of self-governed halflings in the Inner Sea. The Ullum halflings have lived in and around the forest for centuries, enjoying simple lives and often adopting professions that require dedication and discipline. Unlike the Kelids, the Ullums have always had a friendly relationship with the Taldans, whom they view as neighbours rather than conquerors. Northern Tandak. The northern Tandak prefecture stretches from the northern edges of the Verduran forest to the fog peaks west of the Broken Bridge River. For much of the past 1,000 years, northern Tandak's relative isolation sheltered it from the worst decay and excess of Taldor proper, and while never rich, the prefecture long enjoyed moderate comfort thanks to the variety of environments it covers and friendly trade with neighbouring Galt. That same isolation has become a curse since Galt collapsed in the Civil War, and began burdening northern Tandak with a dearth of trade partners and an overabundance of nobles in exile, draining the region's resources and patience. Much of northern Tandak's limited military resources are overtaxed in the effort to protect the region's farmers and ranchers from a soft invasion of Galtan brigands, criminals, and dissidents hoping to spread the upheaval of their native soil into Taldor. A largely rural prefecture, northern Tandak lacks major settlements. Few travel the sparsely populated plains, and more beasts prowl the region than any civilized prefecture to the south would tolerate. The prairies support wary flocks of axbeaks, vast herds of aurochs and antelope, and packs of wolves that prey on both. And while most of Taldor is bereft of the majestic creatures, as they were hunted to near extinction after the dragon plague, natives in northern Tandak have reported juvenile examples of many breeds of true dragon, drakes, and wyverns in its various climes. The prefecture's ruling family, House Falspar, reigns from a large country estate in the Fog Peak foothills, a mere stone's throw from the fork at Broken Bridge River and Fog Creek. The current ruler, Grand Duchess Beatiza Falspar, adores hunting, animal husbandry, and exploring her family's vast land holdings. The relative isolation of the region forces her to witness and address the plights of her people, making northern Tandak among the best places in Taldor for the common folk, though strained resources and the lack of major settlements still lend themselves to a hard-scrabble life. Unlike many of Taldor's aristocracy, Duchess Falspar finds politicking, and even polite conversation, deeply taxing, and she sometimes disappears into her family's wilder lands for days or weeks on a hunting trip. In social occasions, she is quiet and stern, watching with a hunter's patience that leaves many of the urban elite ill at ease. Avin. Taldor's largest and northernmost prefecture, Avin stretches from the Fog Peaks to the Falling River, and west to the Verduran Forest. Named for Lord Avin Dembury, the first Grand Duke to rule it in the earliest days of the Empire, Avin is populated primarily by farmers, ranchers, and artisans, especially in Yanmas, and the seasonal caravan drivers who come and go throughout the year. As Avin is one of the breadbasket prefectures, its economy revolves heavily around its many farms and ranches. Producing much of Taldor's wheat, and gifted with access to Khazmar trade and the presence of the Taldan horse, Avin enjoys an unusual level of political influence for such a far-flung region. Yanmas is the capital of the Avin prefecture, and Grand Duke Brois Ringiana dutifully oversees the region's affairs from his estate a few miles outside the city. A former commander of the Taldan horse, while his mother ruled the prefecture, Ringiana has a special affinity and loyalty to the cavalry, and his rivals criticize his subservience to the military rather than the other way around. Aside from its role as a center of commerce and travel, Yanmas serves as the center of operations for Taldor's extensive cavalry, the Taldan horse. Commanded by General Relison Gwain, the Taldan horse consists of both horse and elephant cavalry, with the latter used primarily in ceremonial processions or in the construction of new roads. From Yanmas, the Taldan horse deploys to aid other military units elsewhere in the Empire, especially along the southern border with Qadira, and patrols the Tandak Plains and the Whistling Plains to the east. Tandak. The wide Tandak Plains stretch east from the Selen River, south of the Verduran Forest, and they form the bulk of the Tandak prefecture. In ancient times, the Verduran Forest stretched all the way to the sea and as far south as the river Porthmos, but millennia of logging to fuel imperial ambitions reduced the southern expanse of the woods to a mere fraction of its former size and transformed the landscape into swampland along the coast and rolling prairie further inland. Years of intense farming following the deforestation depleted the prairie soil, and today little grows there beyond tough grasses, thorny shrubs, and stands of stunted, twisted trees. Abandoned towns dot the landscape, left by residents who drained the region of resources and moved on, often following the receding forest line. The bustling port of Casimir devours most of the resources produced in the prefecture, much of it carted from the eastern edge of the region across the hazardous Blackwood Swamp, which surrounds the city, With its land now unfit for agriculture, Tandak's economy relies almost entirely on Casimir's shipyards and extensive trade networks. The Imperial Navy shipyards produce not only the entire fleet of Taldor's own navy, but also hundreds of vessels of varying size and purposes sold to clients throughout the Inner Sea region. Taldan law prohibits supplying military ships to other nations, even supposed allies, but the sturdily built vessels of Casimir's shipyards make fine fighting machines with only moderate retrofitting. The entire prefecture currently stands on politically shaky ground. The previous Grand Duke, Forth Bosbeli, popularized a rumor that he had won his title as a war hero who started out a pauper on the streets of Casimir, and that Grand Prince Stavian III exalted him as a reward for bravely slaying an enemy general. While other nobles found the patently false claims scandalously entertaining, Taldor having not been at war with an enemy for over a century, they won Bosbeli's support and a good deal of unpaid labor from the common people of Casimir. The Grand Prince found this propaganda far less amusing, however, and eventually stripped Bosbeli and his family of their title and lands, so he could embrace the pauper lifestyle of which he seemed so enamored. The underclasses of Casimir were equally displeased when he was exposed, and the riots that followed saw the disposed Grand Duke torn physically limb from limb and hung from a yardarm in Casimir's harbour. The aristocracy of Tandak and Taldor now watch breathlessly, hoping this single outpouring of violence is an isolated incident, rather than the genesis of a Galtan-style popular revolt. The prefecture's new ruler, Grand Duchess Caesara Tiberan, is Bosbeli's niece. Coming from a background in academia, she has opted to forgive the masses and downplay the Bosbeli riots. She has spent the last 7 years nervously inventing crimes her uncle perpetrated against the people to retroactively justify their outrage and make the uprising seem like more and more an atypical exercise in justice rather than a viable tool the unwashed masses of Casimir could wield against the nobility at any time. Krearis. The most populous non-coastal Taldan prefecture, Krearis stretches from the falling river in the north to the base of the World's Edge Mountains in the south. The rugged terrain, rocky hills, and boggy creeks of Krearis create dozens of distinct and isolated landscapes, from rolling fields to primeval forests to marshy wetlands. The hardy, stubborn people who settle here embrace this isolation, making them resistant to any sort of central authority. The region sees frequent infighting among its earls, and especially among its barons, sometimes exploding into bloody battles. The ruler, Grand Duke Borand Heskeler, does what he can to maintain the peace, but faces disputes and feuds that date back centuries, and the crown offers little support or concern so long as goods continue to flow. Heskeler is especially unpopular in noble circles, having taken a dwarf, the Lady Grella of Tagaret, as his wife. The marriage angers Taldan traditionalists, both for the insult of bringing dwarven blood into Taldan noble circles and for the question of inheritance it raises for the infertile couple. Distant cousins from all branches of the Heskeler line are already petitioning the crown for a guarantee of succession. The prefecture's varied terrain meant the dragon plague affected it more than most other prefectures, as multiple breeds of metallic dragons made their homes throughout Krearis' isolated biomes. Rumors persist even 1,000 years later that undiscovered hordes, left abandoned when their owners fell into a mindless rage, remain hidden throughout the region, and locals and foreigners alike dream of discovering one and propelling themselves into the upper echelons of the Taldan elite. Taldor's fourth largest settlement, the city of Meheto, serves as the capital of Krearis. Meheto boasts the largest dwarven population in Taldor, thanks to long-term efforts to encourage immigration from the Five Kings Mountains to fill out the city's extensive mining and metalworking industries. Its forges produce most of the Taldan's military arms and armor, and the combination of dwarven craftsmanship and Taldan infrastructure means that a steady flow of exports makes its way into the larger Inner Sea economy. The World's Edge Mountains Province. Home to some of Taldor's tallest peaks, the World's Edge Mountains form a natural defense against invasion from the Whistling Plains. The mountains are home to some of the oldest ruins in Taldor, including many that predate even Earthfall. While the region lacks large settlements, the provincial population remains relatively high, thanks to dozens of tiny mining towns, and even more seasonal camps scattered throughout the territory. The province's eastern border is ill-defined, and ambitious nobles often vie for control of the region's lands in hopes of expanding their holdings and eventually claiming a newly formed prefecture for themselves. On the borders of Taldan's province of the World's Edge Mountains, the dwarven sky citadel of Krevenkus remains under dwarven control, but only barely. Its connections to the Darkland remains open, and the Sky Citadel has been besieged by Duergar, Drow, and other menaces of the Darklands for generations. The few remaining inhabitants who have not migrated to Meheto or the Five Kings Mountains live primarily in the Citadel's nearly abandoned central keep. The dwarves welcome adventurers who promise to rid the Citadel of its current threats, and perhaps even prevent such creatures from returning. Opparos. Home to Oppara, Taldor's shining capital, Opparos is both the most populous and most economically stratified prefecture. Nowhere else in Taldor boasts such a high concentration of wealth and power, thanks to the royal family, the senate, and the countless nobles and bureaucrats that surround them. Conversely, the number of poor, hungry, and wretched of Oppara dwarf those of Casimir, Yanmas, and Zimar combined, all scrabbling to live off the table scraps left behind by the elite standing above them. The rest of the prefecture shares the capital's disparity. In every direction, urban sprawl presses up against noble estates, lavish institutions, and grandiose establishments that spread across most of the prefecture like a cancer. Wedged between all of this, dingy and desperate communities of artisans, laborers, and servants live on top of one another in deplorable conditions. Despite these disparities, the prevalence of iconic monuments, statues, and well-maintained public spaces instills all residents of the prefecture with a strong sense of national pride that borders on the fanatical. Despite its reputation as Taldor's most cynical, jaded, and politically cutthroat prefecture, Opparos wraps its citizens in a patriotism that colors all their actions. Even criminal organizations across the prefecture proudly consider themselves loyal Taldans and do as much to rout foreign conspirators and criminal syndicates as the Lion Blades, making Oppara almost immune to the influence of foreign criminal powers such as the far-eating Zarni. Opparos features the most diverse and independent economy in Taldor, with healthy trade, industry, and manufacturing, as well as rich farmland supported by the river Porthmos's annual flooding. Many of the greatest Taldan wines and brandies hail from the region's vineyards, as well as a fortune in barley, figs, olives, and pomegranates. Inundated with rocky ridges and outcroppings, the land serves most cattle poorly, but goats and sheep flourish. More than anything, though, Opparos' fortunes lie in fishing, and much of the local lifestyle and cuisine celebrates the bounty of the Inner Sea. Called the Gilded City, Oppara is one of the Inner Sea region's largest and most influential cities. As the capital of both Taldor and Opparos, it houses some of the greatest institutions of the empire, including the Imperial Palace, the Senate, the War Ministry, the Kitharodian Academy, the Rhapsodic College, the world's largest temples to the dead god Aradin, the secret nerve centers of both the Brotherhood of Silence and the Lion Blades, and countless monuments to Taldor's illustrious past. Beneath all the wealth and pageantry, though, Oppara is plagued by crime, mismanagement, neglect, and widespread poverty. The nobility cannot avoid exposure to such conditions, instead embracing various myths of meritocracy as they distract themselves with balls, fashions, and gossip. They believe that if the poor would simply apply themselves, serve the military with distinction, or become adventurers of renown, the Grand Prince would exalt them into nobility. Thus, the problem of poverty is seen as a failing of ambition and moral character, and the aristocracy, even those who descend from long lines of nobility, have earned their lofty position. Like most Taldan cities, Oppara is its own barony, with the Grand Prince traditionally serving as the Baron. In some circumstances, especially during wartime, an emperor appoints an heir or other family member to serve as Baron instead. The city's current leader, Baron Altar Vinmark, a former member of the Ilfin Guard, watched over Grand Princess Eutropia's father, Stavian III, after the distraught former Grand Prince had to bury her older brother when he died in childhood. The Grand Prince repaid his kindness by exalting the foreign warrior to the title of Baron. Kazuhn. Far from the largest or wealthiest of the prefectures in Taldor, modern Kazuhn serves almost entirely in a role supporting Oppara. Although Kazuhn was once a fairly cosmopolitan prefecture, nestled between the mighty Porthmos River and the southern tip of the world's edge, centuries of exploitation and economic specialization have eroded its artisan economy and urban centers. Almost all of the prefecture's large settlements stand all but abandoned, with no industry or travel to support them, and alongside them aqueducts crumble and the smaller canals choke on vegetation. Only farmlands and orchards, almost exclusively sprawling noble estates worked by servants or tenant farmers, see any maintenance of services and infrastructure. These massive farming operations produce an overwhelming majority of Taldor's wheat and flax, as well as apples, pears, and various stone fruits. Even the nobles who own most of the prefecture's fertile farmland no longer live in Kazuhn, preferring the cosmopolitan lifestyle of nearby Oppara. Some, including the prefecture's ruler, Grand Duchess Melia Denzarni, maintain opulent country estates to which they escape from the rigors of city life. These properties play host to countless week-long galas, formal hunts, secret trysts, and illicit, sometimes seditious meetings with political co-conspirators. Kazuhn is also the prefecture containing the ruins of Pegador, the great refuge built by Aslanti refugees who survived the Earthfall cataclysm. Today, several dozen researchers and their retinues plumb the city's mysteries, collaborating and sharing information as often as they jealously guard it from one another. Most notable among these is Verduran Province, a noted half-elven Pathfinder whose research focuses on a series of secret temples dedicated to the Aslanti god of destruction, Skal. Porthmos. Named for the legendary general who led the first army of exploration up the Selen River, Porthmos is one of the largest prefectures in the nation. Porthmos straddles the Porthmos Gap, which serves as a gateway to the Whistling Plains, a vast prairie that separates Taldor from the many nations of Kazmarin. With few natural resources and little water, the Sea of Grass serves as a natural barrier dissuading eastward expansion. The river Porthmos and its north and south forks, called the North River and the South River by locals, neatly divides the prefecture into 3 distinct districts. West of the river, the prefecture seems typical of Taldor. In the south, farms grow barley, wheat, and various hardy fruits. Those in the foothills of the north survive by quarrying tough granite used downriver to construct durable cities and fortifications, as well as mining gold, iron, and silver. But even millennia after the Empire's founding, much of Porthmos east of the river fork remains untamed, its few settlements small and isolated from one another, and from the rest of Taldor by steep hills, wide plateaus, and harsh winters. Locals survive primarily by sustenance farming, and by mining the lead used throughout the Empire. This harsh lifestyle, and the toxic metal, means short lives of backbreaking labor and illness. Isolation from the heart of the nation allows Porthmos's various nobles to operate largely unchecked. The current Grand Duke, the sadistic and ruthless Thestro Briarsmith, rules from the prefecture's capital city of Sardis, and he has made himself a de facto dictator of everything east of the river Porthmos. The Grand Duke operates a secretive prison for his political rivals and crushes what few freedoms and rights Taldor guarantees its citizens elsewhere in the Empire, such as the free mobility that would allow locals to escape their brutal lives. Lingian. For centuries, the agricultural prefecture of Lingian offered little of interest to non-residents. It is no economic powerhouse, producing only middling quality flax grain, olives, and wine, has no exceptional industry, and produces few heroes or artists of legend. Even its moderate weather sees few terrible storms or truly beautiful weather. Locals are primarily proud of the role their ancestors played in resisting Khadiran occupation in 4083. Many summer festivals involve tall tales, plays, or reenactments of those years, but most of Taldor overlooks these battles in favor of the more recent and valorous victories at the hands of Sophra, Moda, and Whitemarch. Lingian's perpetual runner-up status has begun to change a little over the last generation, however, as Opparos' exploitative demands of its northern neighbor Kazuhn has sucked the prefecture dry. Lingian's relatively untouched natural splendor and abundant inexpensive land increasingly attract business interest and aristocratic attention. It's less fertile than Kazuhn, however, so these increased demands strain Lingian's economy as many farmers switch over to cash crops rather than growing the grains and produce needed by locals. More and more farms and unsettled lands are being bought up and transformed into new country estates, and while the timber and construction industries are booming, a tide of displaced natives, many of whom know no life other than farming and hunting in the region, now sweep into Opparos and other nearby cities. Lingian's local government is corrupt, even by Taldan standards, but until the recent economic boom, its potential for abuse was curbed by the meager funds available. Today, Grand Duke Morin Zelvingian welcomes Opparan attention and coin with open arms, while ignoring the corruption of his counts, barons, and earls who drive peasant families from their land. Even as he cracks down on small-time bandits, many of whom were among the hungry poor the boom economy has left behind, Grand Duke Zelvingian turns a blind eye to larger criminal enterprise, such as the lucrative smuggling operations that provide the prefecture's newest residents with whatever drugs and illicit pleasures they desire, and he diverts public resources and law enforcement away from those problems. This simple strategy serves him well. Thanks to kickbacks and his own criminal land deals, Grand Duke Zelvingian has matured from a poor backwater laughingstock to one of the richest and most influential nobles in Taldor. Ligos. A largely agrarian prefecture between River Porthmos and the southern range, Ligos is the playground of Opparos' elite. The rolling plains and gentle hills covering most of the prefecture are suitable for crops, but long dry summers limit yields. Most landowners prefer to use their territory as grazing land for cows and sheep, and much of the prefecture's economy revolves around cheese, meat, and wool. Taldor's nobility have an entirely different use for Ligos, however: horses. Equestrianism, along with horse breeding, training, and racing, have dominated the public perception of Ligos for as long as the empire has existed, and proud residents insist their ancestors were the first to domesticate horses. Today, Ligos' ranches still provide many of the army's horses and draft animals. Socialites of all stripes buy their mounts from a handful of prominent stables dating back millennia, with equine ancestries tracked more carefully than that of their own. And every ranch hopes to win newfound respectability for their bloodlines by winning the prefecture's annual Emperor's Mile, a grueling 100-mile race through the Emperor's Pass and ending at the Shirshire Ranch, the race's sponsor for the last 1,200 years. Ligos Prefecture boasts the most recently appointed ruler, in Grand Duchess Destilita Solari. Solari won the title only 4 years ago after the crown charged her predecessor and cousin, Grand Duke Justin Verateros, with treason. The veracity of this charge and the evidence presented against the Grand Duke remain in doubt by a silent majority of nobles, but none dare speak out for fear that Lady Solari may find it within her resources to produce evidence of their own wrongdoings, real or imagined. Solari remains the center of the political rumor mill. She rebuffs even the most eligible suitors from across the empire, leaving many puzzled as to her plans to secure alliance and eventually establish heirs to the position she clearly expanded a great deal of capital to acquire. Nevertheless, the promise of the power and wealth accompanying the hand of the new Grand Duchess draws even the most skeptical of suitors. Moda. Moda boasts a strong maritime economy, bolstered by the Taldan Imperial Navy, which maintains a constant presence in the prefecture's ports as a deterrent against Khadiran aggression. Yet while the fishing communities on the coast thrive, the myriad smaller settlements spread throughout Moda's inland territory struggle to make ends meet. Much of the prefecture, which lies at or below sea level, was once arable farmland, created by an ingenious irrigation system of canals. Thousands of years of neglect have rendered vast stretches of territory into moors and marshland. Only the hardiest crops survive, and beyond seafood, the prefecture's primary exports are hemp, rice, and spinach, with only a fraction of the earlier crop of grapes, olives, and wine remaining. The region's ruler, Grand Duke Nestor Delridia, is a retired admiral in the Taldan Imperial Navy, and youngest son of Baron Delridia of Riddenport. Grand Prince Stavian III elevated Nestor to the rank of Grand Duke after Nestor won a decisive victory against a fleet of Catapeshi slaving galleys that terrorized the route between Oppara and Absalom. Royalists throughout the country tout the Grand Duke as proof of Taldor's meritocracy, urging those with ambitions of aristocracy, wealth, and fame to serve in Taldor's military. Delridia governs from Golsafar, the prefectural capital and his adopted hometown. The Grand Duke's naval record has earned him the respect of the sailors and commanders stationed in Golsafar, and he regularly meets with naval advisors on matters of border and coastal security. While he focuses on these efficiencies, Delridia tends to look outwards towards the sea rather than inland, and for as well as he manages the prefecture's ports and waterways, he is inept at addressing the plight of the landlocked counties under his control, which suffer as the dikes and levees that keep their lands arable slowly crumble. Sophra. Sharing the longest and most heavily fortified border with Qadira, Sophra stretches from the border wood's western edge to the ancient battlefield of Urfa Halij. The people of Sophra are a hardy folk, accustomed to the hardships of war and living under occupation. Military service is mandatory for all families, who must contribute at least one child to the prefecture's defense for a minimum of 2 years, and even those who don't serve in the prefecture's forces of the Taldan phalanx often drill with their local militia and town guard. Sophra receives a great deal of military funding from Oppara, and even citizens who do not serve as soldiers often work for the Taldan army in other fashions, whether as hostlers for cavalry mounts, herbalists and healers keeping forces healthy, or laborers and architects constructing the region's countless fortifications. Some subsistence farming supports northern supplies, but Sophrans are wary of growing crops that could potentially feed occupying forces. The primary exception is sugarcane, which was originally imported by occupying Qadiran forces early in the Grand Campaign and now flourishes along much of the eastern Jalrun River. Sophra, more than any other Taldan territory, changed hands often during the many military conflicts. Over the millennia, the land has alternated between Qadiran and Taldan control, and few lines of Grand Dukes maintained the title for more than a handful of generations. Whenever the territory changed hands, its new rulers invariably stripped their predecessors of their lands and fortunes to stymie organized resistance, usually imprisoning or executing them as well. Because of the prefecture's militarized nature, the Grand Duke traditionally rules jointly with the High Strategos, Taldor's supreme military commander. Prior to the Taldan Civil War of 4717, Sophra's obsequious Grand Duke Urginos Vobilar deferred in almost all situations to High Strategos Maxillar Pytherius. Having been an officer of middling quality and recognizing Pytherius' strong connections to the crown, Vobilar had no interest in risking his future by challenging the likely next emperor. His decision to back Pytherius during the Civil War means he has since been replaced as Grand Duke, but the new Grand Duke has not been named yet. In the War for the Crown campaign that my group played, my own player character, the son of local Sophran lord and a senatorial hopeful named Vespero Frascati, became the new Grand Duke of the Sophra prefecture and the new High Strategos in the aftermath of the war. Whitemarch. The mountainous region of Whitemarch has, like Taldor's other southern prefectures, changed hands countless times over the millennia in the constant conflict with Qadira. Its rough, hilly terrain and wide valleys made Whitemarch a frequent battlefield in the Grand Campaign, offering easy locations to dig into and hold, but making both advancement and retreat difficult. Centuries of fierce fighting toughened the people of this prefecture, making them a cynical and practical lot who have little concern with who collects taxes so long as they are left in peace. Most commoners in the region work the region's famous marble and granite quarries, or farm just enough to live. Many join the military at some point in their lives to secure a pension to supplement these meager incomes. Like other remote prefectures, Whitemarch is less cowed than Taldor's heartland. What roads exist are ancient. That they still exist at all is a testament to Taldan engineering, and with half the prefecture lying in or beyond the southern range of the World's Edge Mountains, the rainy springs and snowbound winters leave communities completely cut off for 6 to 9 months a year. Banditry is common, but more common are raids from the Gouged Eye, an orc tribe that's one of the largest in eastern Avestan and widely known to indulge in cannibalism. Members of the prefecture's long-ruling family, House Darahan, are renowned for their skill as knights and monster hunters. Many Darahan scions dedicate their entire lives to the military or to the Church of Abadar or Ryamade, and many high-ranking members of both faiths in Taldor hail from the Darahan line. The Grand Duchess Vivexis Darahan served 4 tours of duty on the ramparts of Vigil. The youngest of 12 children, Vivexis never expected to inherit Whitemarch, but each of her elder siblings died under tragic and suspicious circumstances, which seemed to spare her only by virtue of her physical distance from Taldor. Darahan performs her duties as Grand Duchess honorably, but she secretly wishes some loophole would permit her to leave Whitemarch so she could pursue her own adventures.